The chamber was built to impress. 14 curved tiers of polished stone rose above the floor like the inside of a cracked shell. Each seat filled with delegates who wore their species' importance, the way some creatures wear their coloring loudly, and on purpose. The light was gold. The acoustics were perfect. Every word spoken here carried the weight of 100 worlds. Ambassador Layla Okafor sat alone at the human seat and read maintenance reports on a handheld screen. She had brought no aides, no legal team, not even a junior attaché to carry water and look concerned. She had a chair, a screen, and a cup of something hot that had gone cold 2 hours ago. Around her, the chamber hummed with the specific, self-satisfied energy of an institution that had long ago confused its own procedures for wisdom. The motion had been introduced by Councillor Vreth of the Marek Dominion. He was the kind of speaker who understood that length was authority. He had been talking for 40 minutes. He talked about maturity thresholds and civilizational benchmarks, and the importance of maintaining the integrity of a body whose decisions shape the fate of inhabited space. He talked about humanity's statistical footprint, which was small. He talked about humanity's developmental index, which was, he noted with visible regret, still within a range the council classified as emerging. He did not look at Okafor while he spoke. She did not look up from her screen. Vreth finished. The chamber shifted. 3 other delegates added supporting remarks. The Solon Collective's representative offered a procedural clarification. The Thalry Union noted, formally, that they were not opposed. A delegate from the Outer Ring Confederacy spoke for 11 minutes without saying anything that hadn't already been said, which was a kind of art. Councillor Amethyst of the Solon Collective had been quiet the entire session. She sat 3 tiers up from Okafor, her long hands folded on the desk in front of her. She was one of the oldest members of the council. She had been present when humanity first received its observer seat 22 years ago. She remembered that day. She was remembering it now, which was not a comfortable experience. The vote call came. Okafor set her screen face down on the desk. Not with drama. The way a person sets something down when they no longer need it. The motion. To suspend humanity's observer status, pending a full civilizational review. To close the associated trade corridors during the review period, and to remove humanity's right to speak on any resolution in which it held an interest. 14 votes in favor, 1 against. Amethyst's light stayed red while every other panel on the board turned green. Nobody commented on it. The outcome was not in doubt, and the margin made the dissent decorative. Vreth waited for the count to finalize. Then he leaned slightly forward, not enough to be theatrical, just enough to signal that what came next was a gift. He said that the council wished humanity no hardship. He said the door remained open. He spoke about the review process, which was thorough and fair, and which humanity could engage through proper written channels. He spoke about humanity's potential, which was real, and which the council would be glad to recognize at the appropriate developmental stage. He said he hoped this would be understood, in the spirit it was intended. The chamber waited. Okafor looked up from the desk, where her screen lay face down. She looked at Vreth for exactly long enough to make the silence mean something. Then she said, acknowledged. She picked up her screen. She picked up her cold cup. She stood, pushed in her chair, with the care of someone who had been raised not to leave a mess, and she walked out of the chamber at the same unhurried pace she had walked in. The door did not slam. It closed the way all the doors here closed, with a soft hydraulic exhale that was almost polite. Vreth watched the space where she had been. The discomfort that moved through him then was faint and sourceless, the kind a man feels when he has checked every variable and confirmed every calculation, and still finds himself wondering, very briefly, if he asked the right question. It passed. He had won, and he knew what winning felt like. The chamber began to empty. Delegates gathered in clusters, trading the particular relief of people who have accomplished something difficult and do not have to think about it anymore. Amethyst did not join any cluster. She moved through the dispersing crowd and into a side corridor that was empty at this hour, and she stopped there, and she took out a file she had been carrying for 3 months. 93 pages. The cover read, Systemic Dependency Analysis, Human operational footprint in council-adjacent infrastructure, prepared for internal review. She had prepared it herself, in her own time, because something had felt wrong to her for longer than she could name, and she had needed to know the shape of the wrongness before she could speak about it. She knew the shape of it now. She had known it for 3 months. She stood in the empty corridor and looked at the file and made the calculation that a person makes when they have information that would change an outcome, but the outcome is already decided. She had voted against. She had been 1 vote. What she held in her hands was evidence for a case that had already closed. She told herself she would send it before the week was out. She put the file away. Down in the main chamber, the cleaning staff moved between the curved tiers with practiced efficiency. They wiped the desk surfaces. They collected the cups. They straightened the chairs. At the human seat, they found nothing to collect. No cup, no documents, no sign that anyone had sat there at all, except the chair, pushed neatly in, aligned precisely with the ones on either side. Wherever Okafor went when she left the chamber, she left no trail of having been. 3 corridors away, in a communications bay staffed by 2 people at this late hour, a single outgoing message cleared the encryption queue. It was addressed to the Office of Human External Affairs, marked routine, flagged for no particular urgency. The message was 1 word: confirmed. The operator on duty logged it and moved on to the next item. It was not interesting. Nothing about it suggested that it was the first gear turning in a mechanism that had been waiting a long time to be set in motion. The gold lights in the chamber dimmed. The session was closed. In his private office on the upper tier, Vreth poured himself a drink and reviewed the day's proceedings with the satisfaction of a man whose plans had unfolded cleanly. The discomfort he had felt earlier did not return. He was not the kind of man who paid attention to what he couldn't name. It was one of his greatest strengths. It was the thing that was going to undo him. The first thing the council received was paperwork. Not a protest. Not a formal objection through the arbitration channels. Not the kind of noise an expelled entity usually made: the press statements, the appeals, the wounded communiques sent to every sympathetic party in the hope that someone would intervene. Just paperwork. It arrived the morning after the vote and kept arriving for 3 days. Contract terminations, maintenance handoff schedules, service withdrawal notifications. Each one was properly formatted, correctly addressed, signed by the appropriate human department, and accompanied by a transition timeline ranging from 30 days to 90, depending on the criticality of what was being handed off. The tone throughout was professional. Warm, even. There was a standard closing line on every document. We appreciate the cooperation extended during this operational period and wish all parties continued success. Vreth's administrative staff compiled them into a summary report and sent it up the chain with a note that said, "Volume is significant. Content appears routine. Suggest standard processing." Vreth read the summary at breakfast and moved on to more pressing matters. The summary was 41 pages long. Nobody read all 41 pages. The Merrick Dominion's primary transit hub ran on a network of waypoint beacons, strung across 7 jump corridors. The beacons needed calibration every 40 days. The calibration required a software suite that the original installation team, a human engineering firm, under a 12-year contract, had developed, maintained, and updated for a decade and a half. The contract termination notice had been filed. The transition timeline was 60 days. The replacement schedule noted that trained Merrick technicians were recommended to complete a certification course before assuming responsibility. The course was available through the human engineering firm's training division. The certification course had a waiting list. On day 31, after the vote, a Marek heavy cargo hauler, designated MV Soren 7, missed its transit window at Corridor 4. The beacon at waypoint marker 12 had drifted by 0.003 degrees due to microgravitational variance. It was an update. The human monitoring system would have caught and corrected automatically, the way it had caught and corrected it 11 times in the past 18 months. The update had not been applied. The beacon was no longer being monitored. The Soren 7's navigation computer, flagged the discrepancy but defaulted to the beacon reading because the beacon was a certified primary reference. The hauler arrived at the jump threshold 4 seconds off alignment. 4 seconds was enough. It didn't jump. The fail-safes caught it. The ship held in place while its navigation system reset, and the crew tried to understand what had happened. They waited 6 hours for an emergency calibration team. The team arrived and did their best. The Soren 7 made its jump 18 hours late. It was a delay, not a disaster. The incident report went to the Marek Transit Authority. The Transit Authority noted the beacon irregularity. They filed a maintenance request through the system they had always used. The system routed the request to a human maintenance queue that no longer existed. 11 years before the vote, a human researcher named Dr. Callan Maris had looked at the Solon Collective's border station network and noticed that their atmospheric recycling units threw error codes that nobody was interpreting correctly. The error codes were a different notation system than the one in the official documentation. Dr. Maris had spent 3 weeks decoding the notation and written a diagnostic guide that he shared openly through an informal technical exchange program that had no formal name and no budget and no official standing with the council. He had done it because the problem was there, and he knew how to help. 11 years later, the atmospheric recycling units at Solon Medical Station 7 threw an error code. The code was 4-7 Delta Red. The station's technical staff pulled up the official documentation. The official documentation said 4-7 Delta Red indicated a humidity calibration variance and to run the standard reset cycle. They ran the reset cycle. The error cleared. Dr. Maris's diagnostic guide, which was not in the official documentation, would have told them that 4-7 Delta Red in the third generation units, which were all the units at Station 7, indicated a secondary circulation fault that the reset cycle would suppress, but not fix. The guide would have told them to check the auxiliary intake manifold within 24 hours. Nobody checked the auxiliary intake manifold. Station 7 continued running. 3 days after the paperwork finished arriving, Vreth received a briefing from his logistics directorate. It was titled, Early Withdrawal Indicators, Transitional Adjustment Assessment. He read it with the focused patience of a man who expects to find what he is looking for. The word disruption appeared 4 times. The word temporary appeared 9 times. The briefing recommended monitoring and noted that most affected systems had transition plans in place and that stabilization was expected within the standard 60 to 90-day window. Vreth dictated a response. Noted, monitor and report at standard intervals. Expected disruption is a natural consequence of structural adjustment. Maintain confidence messaging. He sent it. He felt good about the response. It was the kind of language that projected steadiness, institutional confidence. The council did not panic. The council managed. That same afternoon, a junior aide in his policy division raised a flag on one of the termination notices. It was for something called the Outer Reach Pathogen Surveillance Network, operated by a human research consortium under a subclause of a bilateral health cooperation agreement that had just been terminated. The aide's flag said, Unable to locate equivalent replacement program in council medical database. Recommend clarification on continuity plan. The flag sat in a queue. On an orbital station that did not appear on any official council chart, Director Soren Vance sat in a room with 12 screens and a cup of tea and watched the withdrawal proceed. He was not a council figure. He had never attended a session. His name appeared in no treaty. He had an operational title that was 5 words long and completely accurate. He coordinated the things humans did in spaces nobody had asked them to care about. He had been doing this for 19 years. He watched the Soren 7 incident come in and logged it. Beacon drift, corridor 4. Day 31. He watched the Station 7 error code and logged that too. He watched 2 arbitration cases in the outer ring begin to wobble without their human mediators, and he logged those. He was not doing anything to cause these things. He was simply not doing the things that would prevent them. There was a difference. It was an important difference. His screen showed the withdrawal timeline in clean columns. What had been handed off? What was pending? what was approaching its deadline. Everything was on schedule. Everything had been documented. Every transition notice had been filed correctly and in good faith. Humanity had done exactly what it said it would do, in exactly the way it said it would do it. The gap between what the Council had expected and what was actually load-bearing had always been there. It was simply visible now in a way it had not been before. Vance made a note in his log at the end of the day. He wrote it the way he wrote everything. Plainly. Without decoration. Day 31. Cascade indicators nominal. Proceeding. He finished his tea. He started another. By day 47, the word temporary had quietly left Vreth's briefings. Nobody removed it deliberately. It simply stopped fitting. The Soren 7 incident had become 6 incidents. 3 ships had taken minor hull damage from debris fields in outer ring corridors, fields that had been tracked and cataloged under a human cartographic update program that had filed its last report on day 3 of the Sci-Fi. Withdrawal. The charts were still there. Still accurate, as of day 3. The debris moved. The charts did not. The Merrick Transit Authority opened a formal inquiry. The inquiry found that the cartographic update program had been operating under a voluntary technical cooperation clause in a trade agreement that no longer existed. The inquiry noted this. The inquiry did not know what to do with this. The report landed on Vreth's desk, with a question attached. What is the Council's standard protocol for assuming maintenance of voluntarily provided third-party navigation services? There was no standard protocol. Nobody had thought to write one, because nobody had known such services existed until they stopped. Station 7 at the Solon border had been running for 16 days on a suppressed error. The auxiliary intake manifold, which nobody had checked, developed a secondary fault on day 16. The fault affected 14% of the station's atmospheric processing capacity. It was not catastrophic. It was the kind of fault that gets caught early and fixed in a maintenance cycle without anyone being particularly alarmed. The key word was times early. The station's medical director submitted an emergency requisition for a specialist technician. The requisition went to the Solon Collective's Technical Services Division. The Technical Services Division consulted their certified contractor list. Humans held 12 of the top 15 slots for atmospheric systems in the Solon network. All 12 were on administrative hold, pending review of their status under the new framework. The Technical Services Division found 3 non-human contractors with relevant certifications. 2 were unavailable. The third had not worked on third-generation units in 7 years, and said so honestly. The fault grew to 22% capacity loss while they waited for someone else. The station remained operational. It would keep remaining operational, on reduced capacity, for another 30 days, while the contracting issue worked its way through channels. The patients were fine. The staff were stressed. The medical director wrote a memo that nobody forwarded because nobody knew who to forward it to. The memo said, "We have never had to think about this before." That was true. That was the whole problem. 2 arbitration cases in the outer ring fell apart in the same week. The cases had nothing to do with humanity. A territorial boundary dispute between 2 mid-tier species. A trade rights conflict between a mining consortium and a colonial authority. The kind of grinding, slow-burn disagreements that the Council's arbitration system existed to absorb before they became something worse. Human mediators had been the neutral third parties in both cases, not because anyone had appointed them, because they were good at it and available, and they had a reputation for sitting with both sides long enough to find the place where the argument was really about something other than what it claimed to be. Per withdrawal protocol, they had recused themselves. Per the case's procedural rules, recusal of a third party required replacement before proceedings could continue. There was no replacement mechanism. The cases had been running for months under the assumption that the mediators would continue. Both cases were suspended. Within 8 days of suspension, the territorial dispute generated a fleet positioning incident. 3 ships from one side moved to a contested waypoint. The other side noticed. The posturing was not shooting, but it had the grammar of shooting, the kind of language that, if left in a room long enough, becomes fluent. Amathis flagged it personally and sent it to the Council's crisis monitoring body. The crisis monitoring body noted that their standard de-escalation protocol relied on neutral party facilitation. They asked for a list of available facilitators. The list came back short. Vreth called a closed session of the Council's senior committee on day 52. He walked in with the briefing in his hand, and the specific composure of a man who has decided, in advance, that the facts require careful framing. He set the briefing on the table. He talked about transitional turbulence. He used the phrase several times. He noted that complex systems always experienced adjustment friction when structural changes were made, and that this was expected, and that the Council's institutions were robust enough to absorb it. He watched the faces around the table while he spoke. They were not comforted faces. They were the faces of people who had read the same briefing he had and reached different conclusions. Amethyst said nothing throughout his presentation. She sat with her hands folded, the same way she had sat in the chamber on the day of the vote. She had a file on the desk in front of her, but she didn't open it yet. When Vreth finished, she opened it. She had 93 pages. She gave the committee a summary that was 7 minutes long. She talked about navigation. She talked about medical infrastructure. She talked about the arbitration cases and the fleet incident, and the pathogen surveillance network that had gone dark, the one whose replacement program still had not been identified. Then she said, "We did not vote to remove a junior member who was underperforming. We voted to remove the species that was quietly running the maintenance layer of half of what we call stable space. They didn't make noise about it. They didn't charge for most of it. They did it because they're the kind of people who see something broken and fix it without waiting to be asked." She looked at Vreth. We mistook that for smallness. The room was quiet. Vreth's jaw was set. He was the kind of man who could absorb almost any information and find, in the processing, a way to make it fit the shape of what he already believed. He was working on it now. The reframing was visible on his face, like a calculation running behind glass. He said that this was a negotiating posture, that humanity had anticipated the vote and engineered a dependency crisis to use as leverage, that the correct response was to refuse to reward the behavior and proceed with the review on its original timeline. He said it with complete conviction. A junior delegate from the Thalry Union, a young official who had been in this room for only 18 months, asked a question in a voice that was careful and small. She asked, "What do they want? What would it cost to bring them back?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew, because humanity had not said a word since, acknowledged. On his uncharted station, Vance was on his third cup of tea when the report came in about the 3 independent species. All 3 were non-council, small, technically capable, operating in the margins of the map the way humans had once operated in the margins. They had reached out to Earth through back channels within 30 days of the withdrawal. Quietly, directly, without ceremony. They had said, essentially, "We noticed. We are interested in talking." Vance read the report. He made a note. Day 47. 3 independent outreach contacts confirmed. No response. Issued pending resolution of council situation. Then he made a second note beneath it, which he did not file anywhere, because it was only for himself. It said, "They are not reaching out because they feel sorry for us. They were reaching out because they had seen what the council had not yet fully understood. Humanity, outside an institution that had dismissed it, was not diminished. It was available." The emergency session was called on day 61. Not a closed committee meeting, a full session. All 14 member species, all senior delegates. The chamber lit the same gold it always was, the acoustics the same, the curved tiers filling with people who carried in their faces the particular expression of institutions confronting what they have done. It was not guilt, exactly. It was something harder to name, the specific discomfort of the very competent discovering the limits of their competence. Vreth opened the session. He was still composed. He was a man of tremendous will, and the will was visible now in the way a structure is most visible when something is pressing against it. He introduced the agenda item as an operational review. Not a crisis. A review. Nobody disagreed with the framing out loud, but the room had the temperature of a crisis. The full analysis had taken his staff 11 days to compile. It ran to 217 pages, not counting appendices. Vreth had read it twice. The second reading had been worse than the first, because the first time he had been looking for errors in the data, and the second time he had run out of errors to look for. The headline finding was this: humanity had, over 40 years of observer status, embedded itself into the functional layer of the Galactic Council's operational space in a way that appeared nowhere in any official treaty, mandate, or formal agreement. Not because it had been hidden, because it had never been asked for, never been brokered, never been the result of negotiation or political calculation. It had been done the way humans apparently did a great many things, because the work was there and they were good at it, and it seemed like the right thing to do. 17 navigation maintenance programs, 8 open-source medical research networks, 42 atmospheric systems under informal technical assistance arrangements, 11 arbitration and mediation frameworks, staffed by human-trained or human-operating neutral parties, 6 early warning monitoring systems for deep space debris, stellar event propagation, and biological contagion spread. None of these appeared in humanity's formal observer portfolio. All of them had stopped. The compounding effect, what the analysis called, in bloodless bureaucratic language, cascading operational dependencies times, was now in its second phase. The first phase had been the individual failures, the beacon drift, the station fault, the arbitration collapses. The second phase was what happened when those individual failures touched each other. A delayed cargo shipment caused by navigation issues meant a medical supply shortage at a station already running on reduced atmospheric capacity. A reduced capacity station processing more patients than designed meant the error reporting system flagged conditions that looked like the early signature of the pathogen the surveillance network would have caught. Except the surveillance network was gone, so nobody was certain if it was the pathogen or the equipment fault, or both. It was probably both. Probably was doing a lot of work in the briefing documents. The session proceeded for 4 hours. 3 general themes emerged from the delegates. The first theme was practical. What was still failing? What was the timeline? What could be acquired or rebuilt? And at what cost? This was the most comfortable conversation because it had the shape of a problem with solutions, even when the solutions were expensive and slow. The second theme was structural. How had this dependency gone unanalyzed for so long? This conversation was less comfortable. The answer, which several delegates approached from different directions, and none stated plainly, was that the Council had never looked because it had never imagined it needed to. Observer species provided political representation and trade relationships. They did not provide the plumbing. The assumption was so complete it had never been a conscious assumption. It had just been the air in the room. The third theme was Vreth's. He still believed, or he was still arguing, which was not the same thing but looked the same from the outside, that this was a performed crisis. That humanity had constructed the dependency deliberately, over decades, in preparation for exactly this leverage scenario. That the correct move was to treat it as a negotiation with an adversary who was applying pressure, not as a genuine emergency created by a genuine gap. He laid it out with his usual precision. He cited the pre-prepared quality of the withdrawal documentation, the speed and completeness of the service terminations, the fact that everything had proceeded too smoothly to be reactive. He was not wrong about any of those observations. He was looking at the right evidence and drawing the wrong conclusion from it. Amethyst waited until he finished. Then she stood. She said, "I want to describe 2 different kinds of people." She said the first kind of person watches a system failing and calculates the right moment to reveal the failure for maximum advantage. They build leverage. They position themselves. They wait. She said the second kind of person watches a system and quietly fixes what is broken because they cannot help it. And then when someone tells them to leave, they file their paperwork correctly and hand everything over on a documented schedule because they cannot help that either. She said, Vreth is describing the first kind of person. He believes that is what we are dealing with. I am asking everyone in this room to look at 40 years of behavior and tell me which kind of person you actually see. She sat down. The room was quiet for a long time. Vreth said nothing. He was still running the calculation, still looking for the angle that made the picture fit. He was genuinely brilliant, and the brilliance was genuinely failing him. the way a very sharp tool is useless against the thing it was not designed to cut. The communique was drafted by committee over 2 days. It offered full reinstatement of observer status, full reopening of trade corridors, a formal review process for the outstanding operational gaps, with council resources committed to the transition. The language around the apology had been argued over for most of those 2 days. What emerged was a phrase that Vreth had insisted on, and Amatheus had let stand, because she understood that some dignities could not be stripped in a single document, and the goal was to get humanity back. Not to be right. The phrase was, "The Council acknowledges that the transition period created unintended operational disruptions and expresses its regret for the associated difficulties." It was not an apology. It was the shape of an apology, assembled from parts that Vreth could live with. The communique was sent to the Office of Human External Affairs at the close of business on day 63. Then the council waited. On day 64, a response arrived. The duty officer who received it read it twice, triple-checked the sender credentials, and then walked the physical printed copy directly to Amethyse's office, rather than routing it through the standard system, because the standard system felt inadequate for the occasion. The response thanked the council for its message. Then it noted, with regret, that per Resolution 7, Galactic 2.2.9.1, the resolution the council had passed, on the day of the vote, in the same session, as a procedural companion to the expulsion, humanity was no longer a recognized observer entity. As such, the Office of Human External Affairs was times unable to formally receive or respond to official council communications, times directed to it, in that capacity. It said it hoped the council understood the procedural constraint. It wished the council well. It was signed, "With warm regards, Office of Human External Affairs, Earth." Amethyse read it. She put it down. She picked it up and read it again. Then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She sat back in her chair and closed her eyes and, for a moment, she laughed quietly, privately, the way a person laughs when they see something done so perfectly that anger is not the right response. The council had closed the door. Humanity had simply pointed out, with impeccable courtesy, that the door was closed. If the council wanted a conversation, it would need to open it first. She drafted a reply, not as the council, but as herself, through a private diplomatic back channel that predated any formal agreement, and therefore fell under no resolution. It said, "I understand. Please advise how the council may most appropriately initiate informal dialogue." She sent it. She waited. The reply came in 40 minutes. It contained an address, a time, and one sentence. "Ambassador Okafor will be available." The meeting was not in the council chamber. It was in a conference room on the station's civilian level, a quiet, practical space, with a rectangular table and chairs that didn't carry the weight of 14 tiers of polished stone. No gold light. No designed acoustics. A window on one side, showing the slow movement of deep space. Amethyse arrived first, and sat with her hands on the table, and waited. Ambassador Okafor arrived 7 minutes later. She was the same as she had always been. Same measured pace. Same absence of performance. She set a document case on the table, took her chair, and poured herself a glass of water from the carafe in the center. She did not apologize for being 7 minutes late, because she had not been late. She had arrived when she intended to arrive. Amethyse said, "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Okafor said, "Of course." A pause. Amethyse said, "I voted against the motion." Okafor looked at her steadily. "I know. I was there. I should have done more than vote." Okafor said nothing to that. She did not offer reassurance. She did not say it was all right, because it wasn't all right. And they were both adults who understood that. She simply let the statement sit in the room where it belonged. Then she said, "Let's talk about what happens next." She opened the document case. The agreement was 44 pages. It was bound with a plain cover that had the date on it, and the date was 7 weeks before the vote. Amethyse looked at the date. She looked at it for a long moment. She said, carefully, "This was prepared before the session." "Yes, before the vote." The vote was not a surprise to us. Amethyse absorbed this. The thing she was absorbing was not betrayal. There was nothing hostile in what Okafor was telling her. It was simply a picture of two different ways of operating. The council had seen a political move, and made a political move in response. Humanity had seen an outcome, and prepared for it. Not to fight it. Not to prevent it. To be ready for what came after. How long? Amatheus asked. How long had you been preparing for this? Okafor considered the question. We've been aware that this trajectory was possible for about 12 years. Vreth's intentions became legible to us roughly 3 years ago. She paused. We hoped the trajectory would change. But you prepared anyway. We always prepare. It's not pessimism. It's just what we do. Amatheus thought of 40 years of navigation, maintenance, and medical networks and arbitration work. All of it done quietly. None of it invoiced. All of it careful. She thought, yes, it is what you do. She read the agreement at the table. Okafor sat with her water and did not rush her. The first provision restored humanity to full voting membership, not observer status. The word observer did not appear in the document. The classification was Time's founding partner, Time's a new category that had not existed in the Council's framework before and would require a vote to create. Amatheus looked up. The Council will push back on the classification. The Council can negotiate the language, Okafor said. The substance is not negotiable. The second provision formalized all previously informal technical cooperation under binding contracts with payment schedules, credit attribution, and a clause specifying that any service provided by humanity under the new framework constituted a recognized contribution to Council infrastructure. No more volunteer subclauses. No more informal assistance arrangements that dissolved when the underlying treaty changed. The third provision established a joint operational commission, tasked with conducting the kind of audit that Amatheus had tried to prepare 3 months ago. A full inventory of undocumented dependencies across all Council species, not to exploit the findings, to prevent them from becoming weapons of accident again. Amatheus was listed as co-chair of the commission. She did not comment on that. The fourth provision was short, half a paragraph. It said that human personnel retained the right to suspend services to any party that acted in material bad faith, with 30 days' notice. No council veto. A withdrawal clause, built directly into the terms of return. Amatheus said, "This will be the hardest one. I know. Vreth will call it a structural threat. Vreth is welcome to call it whatever he needs to." Okafor's voice remained even. "We are not coming back to an arrangement where our continued presence can be taken for granted. The service continues as long as the relationship is healthy. That is a normal condition for any relationship. We are simply writing it down this time." The full council session was 3 days later. Okafor came with a delegation for the first time. 7 people, all of them carrying the same quiet competence she carried. People who wore their expertise like comfortable clothes, not like armor or ornament. The chamber was full. Vreth had spent 3 days with the agreement. His staff had gone through it clause by clause. He had proposed amendments, 4 of them, all designed to soften the withdrawal clause and reframe the founding partner classification. Okafor had accepted 1 amendment, a minor adjustment to the payment schedule timeline, and declined the rest. She had declined them in writing, with reasoning, and the reasoning was clean enough that arguing against it in the chamber would require him to say things out loud that he did not want said out loud. He understood, on some level, that he was not negotiating with someone who needed to win. He was negotiating with someone who had already decided what the outcome was, and was simply giving the council the courtesy of arriving at it through proper process. The vote was called. 14 votes in favor. Vreth abstained. It was, Amatheus thought, the most honest vote he had cast in years. He could not bring himself to vote for it. He could not find an argument to vote against it that the room would accept. Abstention was the only move left, and he took it without comment. The agreement passed. Okafor nodded once, the way a person nods when a calculation has come out the way they expected. She did not smile. She did not look at Vreth. She shook Amatheus's hand. Amatheus held it a moment longer than protocol required. Vance got the message on his uncharted station while he was finishing a report. 2 words. Begin restoration. He sat with it for a moment. Not from surprise. He had drafted the first restoration sequence 6 weeks ago, on the same day Okafor had finished the agreement document, because they had worked together long enough that he knew what she would send before she sent it. He had simply wanted to see it in writing. He set down the message and began making calls. Not to council affiliates. Not to the species who had spent 63 days in emergency sessions trying to understand what they had lost. He made those calls too, and he made them first, because the agreement required it, and because it was the right thing to do, and those two things happening to align was the usual state of affairs. But the other calls, the ones to the 3 independent species who had reached out in the first 30 days, those he made with a different energy. He told them that the council situation had been resolved. He told them that humanity's capacity was being restored. And then he said something that was not in any official brief, because it was not the kind of thing that went into official briefs. He said that humanity remembered who had reached out. He said that this was not a small thing. He said that when the new commission began its work, the audit, the inventory, the long and careful process of understanding who was leaning on what, and why those 3 species would be included. Not as periphery. Not as margin dwellers. As partners who had shown good judgment at an important moment. It was not a promise of anything specific. It was the kind of statement that, over time, meant everything. In the council chamber, after the session closed, and the delegates dispersed, the cleaning staff moved through the tiers, the way they always did. At the human seat, now a full voting seat, designation changed in the system. As of an hour ago, they found a glass of water, half drunk. A document case, empty. The papers gone. A chair, pushed neatly in. And on the desk, held down by nothing, a single sheet of plain paper. It was the summary page of the agreement. On it, in handwriting, was a note. It said, "This should have been the arrangement from the beginning. We are glad to try again. We ask only that it be real this time." It was not signed. It didn't need to be. The cleaner looked at it for a moment, then placed it carefully to one side so it wouldn't be thrown away with the rest. Some things, she thought, you kept. Not for history. Not for the record. Just because someone had said a true thing plainly, and the world didn't offer that often enough to waste it,